Okay, and I will wait for the Facebook moment. Do this. So there we go. Hello, Facebook. Okay. We're recording. While we're waiting for Facebook to appear, I will say I'm very happy. Actually, I will say I'm very happy to be back. My apologies for last week. As probably most of you know, I am president of the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic, and there was a meeting called, and it was called for 10 o'clock on last Friday morning, and I was like, wait a minute, but I couldn't miss it. So if folks in the background there, I will actually begin shortly, but if people could make sure that Facebook, because right now I'm not getting any record that Facebook is receiving this at all. So whatever's happening in the background, if folks could, I think that was accidental, and it's entirely possible. Someone said, sure, has to fix that. It's entirely possible that there was an email that said that and I missed it. So maybe I need to be fixed. I don't know, but I'm bad. I have a lot of email issues because I get too many emails. Okay. I would say that I don't know what's happening with Facebook.
Joanne, why don't you go ahead and get started and we'll just take care of that as soon as we can, if that's okay.
That's good. The voice.
This is Sarah's voice, in case you
no, I figured. Okay. Okay. Hello. Hello. And everybody, welcome to what Carolee just told me is the 112th episode of History Matters. And so just coffee. Thank you, Annie. Today, and I just said it a moment ago, today we're going to talk about basically the founders. What are they good for? Which I did think of whatever that song is, where the answer is absolutely nothing, which is not what I meant to be the answer to the question, but that was what was going through my head. Last week we had part one. My apologies for not being here, but I'm here now. And so we're going to have part two of that discussion. We're going to talk about that in a variety of different ways. But that war, thank you, Julia. War, what is it good for? Absolutely nothing. That's not what I'm saying about the founders, as you'll see today when I begin my comments. But before I begin my comments, Annie, I'm going to turn things over to my partner in crime, Annie, who will explain the rules of the game.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to History Matters, and so does Coffee, where we gather every Friday in community, sponsored by the National Council for History Education. My name's Annie Evans. I am the Director of Education and Outreach for New American History at the University of Richmond. We are so excited that everybody is back with us again Friday for the 112th week in a row. NCHE has a lot of great summer programming going on. So if you have not checked out the website lately, ncheteach.org, tons of great stuff going on. Not too late to sign up for some of these wonderful programs to engage with history every day. Please put questions in the Q&A. I'll be checking the Q&A all throughout Joanne's talk. We never get to all the questions, but we do the best we can. And we're really excited to be all back together today.
Okay, excellent. Excellent. Okay, and I have to close chat officially because if I don't, then I will be engaging with you and not with folks out there. Okay, there we go. Okay. So in a way, the question, the founders, what are they good for? That's a way of talking about the relevance, the contemporary relevance of the founders. And in a sense, that's really what I want to talk about. Last week in my recorded, so we don't miss an episode, I talked very briefly, and I'll just 2 or 3 sentences mention what I mentioned last week. I talked about the facts that, and this is obvious, we tend to think about the founders in extremes. So we either glorify them as sort of demigods, superhuman beings, or we denounce them for their many failings. And glorifying them certainly does no good. And I talked last week, in particular, I think about John Adams, who kept saying over and over again in his old age, you know, we weren't perfect. And the reason why he thought that was so important is because the government that they were putting into effect in the founding period was not meant to be for demigods. It was by people for people. Of course, it was by certain people for certain people. We'll come back to that today, but still, they themselves not only didn't see themselves as demigods, but they thought it was irresponsible, and it warped an understanding of what they had done and what the government they had created was, if you were treating them as demigods. And they were spared some denouncing as a group for a very long time. So as I said last week, we need to be critical, and there needs to be more criticism certainly than there's been in the past. And we can't, in the same way that glorifying them warps American history in many ways and makes everything that comes after it look different, makes everything that came after it look different. There you go, grammar. The same is true if you denounce them and dismiss some of the ideas that they came up with, regardless of the fact that they themselves didn't meet that challenge. The ideas matter, and their evolution matters, and the ways that they were used by people who were not officially given access to the impact of those ideas matters. I'm going to talk a little bit about that today, but that was the main point of my comments last week. I also talked about, as I have before, and I'll say it again only because I will refer at various times to the founding and the founders, and to put it in the words I often put it in, there is no founder blob, right? There's not one big blob of founders. The founders thought kind of founders. There was no big sort of one opinion about very much in that time period. So when we say the founders, we sometimes are using it as a shorthand. We sometimes are trying to claim that that entire group of people thought something. And if that kind of claim is being made, often it's for a very specific purpose, sometimes a political purpose or some other kind of purpose. So it's an important thing to remember that there wasn't a founder blob. And as a matter of fact, that conflict and debate and compromise were absolutely built into the system. So the system itself does not assume that you need this blob of people who agree on things for it to function. Okay, and I closed my comments last week by making an obvious point, which is that there were certain people excluded from the group of the founders and the planning that they were doing as far as who various rights extended to. So obviously, you know, the sins of the founders matter too. And those sins and those shortcomings shaped who we are today. So it's important that we address them, that we include them, and that they become part of the American story. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about whether the founders are relevant today. And I'm going to do what historians always do and start out by saying, it's complicated. It is complicated. Are they relevant? Well, let's talk about that a little bit more. First off, I'm gonna talk a little bit more of an idea that I mentioned last time but didn't go into, and that is because their ideas matter even if they didn't live up to them for a variety of reasons. As a matter of fact, I think they matter particularly given that they didn't live up to them, because the failure of living up to those ideas and ideals has helped define the evolution of the United States over time. That failure is part of our history, right? So if you want to understand not only where we came from, but how we've moved over time and how we've gotten to where we are today, not only the ideas are important, but you have to understand and not only accept, but incorporate the fact of fundamental failure to live up to some of those ideals. So I've said this before, even before last week's episode, the ideas and the ideals matter. I'm going even further now and saying they matter particularly because they didn't live up to them. And that failure is part of the American story, along with other things that are less dire. Obviously, the original founding idea of we the people, generally speaking, there were a lot of marginalized groups that they did not incorporate as fundamental people within this new system that they were creating. Obviously, enslaved people were assumed to be inferior, and by some people, I suppose, were not even considered to be people. Indigenous people, same. Women in a different way, but also were assumed to be inferior and thus not full active members in the body politic as voting active members in the functioning of American democracy in that kind of a direct way. Now that those kinds of inequities and that kind of injustice obviously extended far, far, far beyond the founding. So I'm not claiming in inserting that back in that somehow or other their existence in that moment, all of the inequity, all of the injustice in that moment was isolated. It obviously, I don't even really need to say this, but I feel the need to say this. Obviously, that's not true. But as I said a moment ago, the soaring ideas that they were assuming that they were putting into play, you can't own them as a national birthright unless you basically try to bring truth to them and extend them to the people and the groups that generation people did not extend them to. So I think you can't claim the founding as your own and claim that their ideas are a national birthright unless you actually are trying to live up to them and extend those rights and extend those understandings to people who are here, who we now understand and recognize are, we're all one big we, and those principles have to be extended to all if you're going to claim them as national identity. You can claim them, but only if you actually include the nation within that claim. Okay, so those ideas matter. They matter in understanding our history. They matter, I think, in our understanding of what we can claim as rights. I'm going to come back to rights in a moment. I also think those ideas matter, despite the fact that they haven't been, people, we have not lived up to them, and the people who created them did not live up to them. They matter because they've been really effective tools for marginalized people of all kinds to use to fight for their rights, right? That matters too. Even a weapon, a tool or a weapon that people have been able to say, you know, you're depriving us of this right, and we are here, and we are citizens, and we deserve that right. That's powerful, right? If you're going to make rights language, if you're going to say like, well, if you're American, then this right extends to you, that's a wonderful, powerful tool for people to use to step forward and say, okay, that applies to me too. So let's talk about that, right? And you can look over the centuries at American history and see different groups step forward and say, okay, let's talk about it, because you're not extending that to me. And yet here I am, and here others are just like me, and we should be part of that. And if you're denying that, what are you saying about those ideals? So that's a powerful thing to be able to do. Again, the failure to live up to some of these ideas and ideals, in this case, people really used that in a way that ultimately broadened who is included in the American story and in the empowerment of various people within the American political system. I've also talked about before, and another reason why the founders are relevant, in addition to the fact that their ideas and failures matter, is also their humanness matters. And I wrote down humanity and then I crossed it out, because humanity suggests, their kindness. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about, and I talked about this last time, the fact that their humanness, the fact that they were flawed matters, because the government that they created assumed that as well. Right? They were pragmatic. And in a sense, Alexander Hamilton is the spokesman for this view that people are flawed, people are fundamentally flawed, and that they're governed by their passions. And if you are creating a government, it has to be able to channel passions for a more general good. That's his understanding of political power. And in that view, you can understand in part why he thinks there needs to be a concentration of power at the national center, because the system really needs to be able to channel passions. And in his mind, and he said this a number of times, the local and the state attachments to local and state areas are always going to be stronger than attachment to the national. So the national government has to be strong to channel some of those passions. So understanding their humanness and the fact that that was a fundamental assumption about how they saw humankind. They didn't look around and assume there were angels. It's Madison, James Madison had that famous quote about if men were angels, we really wouldn't need government. So that matters too. In their relevance is this acceptance of the fact, and in understanding them better is this acceptance of the fact that no one, not them and not anyone else in the United States was ideal, and the government was structured around that assumption. They were pragmatic about their politics, even as they were sometimes idealistic. And pragmatism leads to another angle that I want to talk about here. And I'm going to talk about it some. I am not by any means an expert on this, and it's to say that this is the charged topic is a vast understatement. And there are people, other scholars, colleagues and friends who have spent many, many years analyzing and discussing the Second Amendment. That said, I do want to make some basic points about it, about thinking about it, about the context in which it was written. And I feel the need to do so. Last week I did the why do the founders, what are they good for, part 1. And I assumed last week that I could easily say Monday, really early in the week, founders, what are they good for, part 2, and that I wouldn't have to wait until Thursday to advertise the topic I wanted to talk about this week. And I agonized yesterday because I didn't see how I could not address what happened this past week. I, like many of us, to say that I'm haunted by it is an understatement. To say that I'm angered by it is also an understatement. I kind of don't know what to do right now with the feelings I have about what just happened. So someone who said, I seem troubled on Twitter. Yeah, yeah. I am. And because of that, I decided that this week, I wasn't going to do the entire episode about the Second Amendment, but I was not going to leave it out because it falls under this larger idea. Founders, how are they relevant? What are they good for? How we think about the Second Amendment is related to that idea. So let's talk about the context in which the Second Amendment was written as a way to highlight things that have been interpreted or added over time. And I will start out by saying, as with everything in the Constitution, it was written in a moment in time, in a certain context, and then ever since, it's been interpreted and reinterpreted and reinterpreted. And that interpretation and the idea of, the originalism, that the original meaning is all that matters. I'm not going to weigh in on that debate, although personally, I think that history has happened and things have changed. And so to go back and say, this is what the founders meant, and thus we can never alter what we think they meant, and the think is important there. There are a lot of problems, I think, with that way of thinking, but regardless, I'm not necessarily weighing in on that. But what I am going to talk about is a little bit of context for the Second Amendment, because obviously, and this week's events are highlighting it in a way, although people who are supporters of how do I put this? Strong advocates for a broad interpretation of the Second Amendment are being a little quiet right now because they should be. But still, we're at this moment where there are people logically speaking up about the need for some kind of reform, about the need for some kind of change, legislative change that shows that we can at least begin to change something that so obviously needs to be changed. And there have been some people responding by saying, no, my rights, right? That's always my rights. It's in the Bill of Rights. Those are my rights. Again, bigger question than I'm going to address here. But what I am going to say is that when you look at the Second Amendment, it's useful to also look at the Constitution in relationship to it, because the Constitution talks about the militia, right? So the Second Amendment is talking about a well-regulated militia and their right to bear arms. It's not saying, you know, everyone has a right to a gun. It's talking about the right to bear arms in the context of a well-regulated militia. So let's talk about that a little bit. Let's talk about what a militia is, and let's talk about what the Constitution says about it. First off, and we've talked about this before, a standing army was a terrifying thing to that generation of people, right? Generally speaking, a standing army was seen as a potential and likely source of tyranny, that a king or a government could use a standing army, or some courtier or important person could warp a standing army and take over and wreak chaos and overturn governments, that standing armies were tools of tyranny. Assumption at the time. And so in these early years, militias were one way to get around the idea of having a standing army. There's a reason why when the government starts off, there isn't a standing army. And that when we're in the quasi-war with France in the late 1790s, suddenly people are like, standing army? If we really don't have one, what do we do? It was a majorly charged issue, not for purely theoretical reasons, but because there was real fear about what the power of what a standing army could do. So militias, and I want to find the phrasing here. Okay, so, and I will mention, and you guys are magical on Google, so if I say this, I know that you will find it. I looked at a lot of places because I wanted to get some of the language that I was using from people who have delved into this more deeply than I. One thing I found particularly useful and that I'll be calling on a little bit and in my talking here is something called Deconstructing the Second Amendment, which I guess was put there by CNN, and includes two historians talking about the Second Amendment. Jack Rakove is one of them, well-known historian who obviously works on the founding period, really works on and has written a lot about James Madison, and he has a legal constitutional angle to a lot of his work. So he says particularly that militias, and these are his words, at the time of the American Revolution and in the early national period, militias were groups of able-bodied men who protected their towns, colonies, and eventually states. So militias were not a standing army. Militias were on a state and local level. They were able-bodied men who came forward to protect their locality and then went back to whatever they were doing before when an emergency was done, right? This is, Jefferson talks about this idea all the time. Like all you need is, you know, in the United States is the yeomen farmers, they'll step forward and they'll defend what they need to defend and then go right back to their farms. That's the idea, at least, of a militia. And it can be, you know, militia on a local level, they can be organized. There can be a group of people who know that they are part of the militia. They need to be trained. They need to be armed in some way. So I'm not saying there's no regulation and no structure to a militia, but a militia was a distinctive thing, was a localized institution. And so when people are referring to the militia or a well-regulated militia, they're actually referring to a very specific thing that is local. And as I mentioned a moment ago, that is also referred to in the Constitution. So a couple examples of that. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution says that Congress will have power to provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. Right? So that's interesting in the Constitution. Congress can call the militia to execute the laws of the Union or suppress insurrections or repel invasions. So basically, Congress has the power to demand from the states that the militia come forward and protect the laws of the Union. So that's the national government being given a power to at least put into play these local militia. And before I go on, I actually realized I want to say one thing. By militia, what they don't mean is Proud Boys or private organizations that have decided that they're militias. Militias in this time period are in a sense, have an official capacity, right? You are a member of the militia, you train and everything else. The government recognizes you. If you go back to the revolution, you can see people coming forward and training and then demanding to be recognized as part of the militia or as a militia unit. So I'm using the word militia, but I want to explicitly designate that I'm not using militia in the way that some people today are using it. The militia in this time period is in essence a government organization, but on a local level. Okay, so the Constitution says that Congress has the power to call forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. That's clause 15. Clause 16, Article 1, Section 8, clause 16 says that Congress shall have power to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving to the states, respectively, the appointment of the officers and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. So first of all, I want to note that there's discussion of, sort of what Congress can do and what the president can do regarding the militia in the text of the Constitution. So the Second Amendment doesn't stand in and of itself. There's discussion of how the national government is going to relate to defense and security on a state level. And Congress is given various abilities to deploy local militias for a national crisis. That's interesting and that matters. And I'll come back to that in a moment. The other thing, of course, to bear in mind, and I'm not going to go into detail here, but arms, bearing arms, obviously arms in this time period, if you want to be exact and say, look, the founders said we have these rights, you certainly can't say they gave rights to have assault rifles, right? They had a very specific understanding of what arms were. Now I'm going to have a legal case. In a case, District of Columbia versus Heller, the Supreme Court decided that the rights outlined by the Second Amendment did apply specifically to possession of firearms for purposes of self-defense. So that decision does say, you know what? Yeah, it does mean people can have guns for self-defense. That decision struck down the Firearms Control Regulations Act of 1975, which regulated owning and keeping firearms in the District of Columbia, which is where Congress had that power. But regardless, the point is the idea that the right to bear arms is specifically about people owning firearms for self-defense, that is partly the result of later interpretation, right? That is not something that goes all the way back. And I want to quote Jack Rakoff here because he says it so well. He says, while there is a common law right to self-defense, most historians think that it would be remarkable news to the framers of the Second Amendment that they were actually constitutionalizing a personal right to self-defense as opposed to trying to say something significant about the militia. So my point here, as I'm talking about the relevance of the founders, is in the same way that I spoke last week and a little bit this week about cherry picking founder quotes to make a point, and that you can do that endlessly, and you can make a founder say whatever you want a founder to say to earn points and score points in the modern realm. People do that all the time. I always tell my students, for the rest of your life, after you take my course, you're going to be cursed with the awareness of when someone is using a founder quote out of context, and you're going to think to yourself, that's not what that means. You're probably correct. That happens all the time. As I said, interpretation, misinterpretation, but also interpretation is something that has happened even as the document was put into play and ever beyond. But if you're going to talk about fundamental rights, I think you need to talk about how that was understood at the time and how that has changed over time. And I'm not being an originalist and saying, but the founders did not mean X. I am saying, okay, this is the starting point. So now let's understand how we got to where we are today. To understand what we assume to be fundamental rights today, we need to understand how we got to that understanding. That's basically what I'm saying. That pointing to the Bill of Rights and claiming it has a certain meaning. And while other people point to it and claim a different meaning, and this is particularly true of the Second Amendment, we need to and always are forced to grapple with interpretation, because that's ever and always the case with our Constitution and with many constitutions. That's what I'm saying, is that when you're talking about the Second Amendment, rather than saying, no, freedom, my rights, originally it didn't start that way. That came over time. So what does that mean? How does that affect the way we understand this? How does that affect how we might want to deal with it? How does that affect ways in which we might effectively deal with it and it have some form of change now? I think that if you assume one meaning across all of time, you're essentially saying that there can't be change. And there can be change. Change was incorporated right into the Constitution. There's a reason you can amend the Constitution. There was an assumption that whatever they were doing then would have to be amended over time. And there's a process for amendment because it shouldn't be easy. The Constitution should be a different kind of document from other documents. It should be harder to change because it's a fundamental document, but it can be changed. So I think particularly right now, in the moment that we're in, it's vitally important to realize that understandings of the Second Amendment and of people's right to bear arms have changed over time, have been interpreted and reinterpreted, and that process matters. And to pretend that there has been one meaning and that anyone who steps forward now and says we can change things is doing something that has never been done before, that's misleading, right? That's wrong. So historical context, that's what I'm speaking for today, right? Is historical context. That matters, not only when you're talking about the founding, but that matters generally. If you're talking about something in the present, even something as controversial as the Second Amendment, the context of how it has changed over time is part of the story of what it is and what it can be. I think that's actually where I'll stop for today. And yes, Carolee is saying mug. You guys can tell in the tone of my voice as I'm heading into the sort of closing part of what I'm saying here. I will indeed, and my apologies for last week in not thinking ahead so that I had a mug. I did not. And I looked over because I could see my Starbucks cup. I didn't want to jump out of my chair and like grab. Anyway, I think the mug this week is less focused on relating to the topic and more the fact that I believe this is the mug. You guys tell me if this is true, because if not, someone else deserves credit. You guys said that you sent me a mug, right? And I said, I don't know if I received a mug. I think this is the mug, right? I'm looking to see, but I'm assuming, yes, okay. Making the world a better place since 1962. It's a wonderful, my 60th birthday mug. I wanted to use it today, not for its meaning, but because it deserves recognition as a fine and wonderful mug. And I wanted to thank you guys because when it was last mentioned, I was like, mug? And I think it's because I somehow or other, I like opened it and I didn't pick up on who gave it to me. Anyway, thank you very much for this mug. Okay.
Joanne, I don't know if they recorded what we did last week when you were gone. I don't think they did. I think they just played you. Like we came on and we had a chat and we all watched it together. We even had an after party.
Wow.
We went on Zoom and had an in-person after party. But we did have a mug reveal because you told me that you didn't get a mug. So we actually had a double mug reveal last week. We had I had my James Madison mug because that's my alma mater, James Madison University. And then I had a Monticello mug for Jefferson, since that's where I live in Charlottesville. So we had a double mug reveal to make up for it.
Okay. I am impressed that even in mug reveals, we never miss a beat.
We never miss a week.
Right on going. Yes. Okay.
So we've got some good questions and
I'm sure.
added.
Sure.
Okay, so the first one comes from our friend Dale in Williamsburg. He says, when Hamilton expresses his views on men's passions, was he expressing the Stoic view that emotion from the original Greek is a feeling of affection, whereas passion is a violent emotion and one has no control over it?
I would say, I mean, I guess I don't think it's one or the other. I think that what he was essentially assuming, I suppose he would say that people have no control over it because he just assumed human beings are by nature passionate, meaning impulsive, and they act in ways that don't always make sense. He says at one point something along the lines of men are reasoning rather than reasonable creatures. So like, they think really well, but they don't always act in a reasonable way. So I guess it would be more in line with the second half of that question. But he really fundamentally, and says it again and again, and in a way that of the non-blob of founders, he comes across as being particularly grim about human nature, right? By definition, humankind is flawed. They have all of these passions. They think for themselves about their own selfish desires. You cannot count on people to do the right thing. And that has to be the absolute founding principle of this government that we're creating. There have to be strong enough channels in place to channel those passions. And that's part of what's behind his desire, not the only reason, but one part of his desire for a strong national government and for a defined, strong structure for that government, is that he wants it to stand up against popular passions. Now, that is not unrelated to the idea of democracy, right? So it's not accidental that Hamilton is also a person who was very unnerved by the politics of the streets, the idea that there would be a populace constantly able to step forward and act. He's uneasy with that. He's not at ease with a democratic politics in the way that we understand it today. And that's related. That's the same idea. You know, someone like Jefferson, much more idealistic, did have this view that people had a sort of internal guide that, generally speaking, would move people in the right direction. You know, he had a much more sunny view of where people could go if given the chance and the education to go there. This is one of those Hamilton Jefferson things where they did not really agree. But Hamilton, I mean, if you read his writings, you know, people change over time. That doesn't change. That's Hamilton, you know, this view, which he considered, you know, not dire and pessimistic, but pragmatic. This is how people are. You know, this is it. This is how they are. You can't make demands on people and assume they're going to do them if they require people to be selfless and giving to some degree that human beings just will not do. You know, he says it bluntly, and to some it probably, you know, sounds ugly. He saw himself as being pragmatic and realistic.
Jean Hobbs has a question. She's asking, did the founders anticipate the impact of business and capitalism on democracy, such as how the gun industry is now pushing their own interpretation of the Second Amendment to promote sales? That's a great question, Jean.
It is a great question. I mean, you know, from the beginning, capitalism and commerce has been bound up with the functioning of the government and, however you want to define democracy. So, for example, the idea of businesses incorporating, right? The idea of corporations, very controversial. They're talking about that in the late 18th century because a corporation somehow or other sounds like maybe a monopoly, some kind of organization. Does it have rights? What rights does it have? It became part of a larger conversation as to what a corporation was, how should it be treated. It's not something that I've particularly written about, but it's a fascinating topic. So there are lots of ways in which, from the very beginning, banking too, right? What is a bank? What rights does a bank have? Where should banks be? How many banks should there be? How do you found a bank? That's a huge, huge issue in this time period. There are all kinds of issues, some of them bound up with assumptions about corruption. So, you know, did people step back and say capitalism shall warp democracy? You know, some people use the word democracy, some didn't. But did they assume that commerce and the desire to earn money or the desire to have money or greed or what they might have called, land mania, all of these different ways in which people were grabbing at things in this time period. Did they assume that that was going to entangle and possibly threaten the political experiment? Yeah, they did. They might not use the same isms that we use, but that conflict was always part of what was going on at the time.
I'm going to put my order in for a land mania mug, Carolee, if you can jot that down. Okay, Melissa Elliott has a good question. She's asking, were there any founders, in your opinion, who knew it was wrong to attack self-liberating Black people or Indigenous non-combatants?
Who knew that it was wrong?
But they knew it was wrong.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people knew it was wrong and they did it anyway. I mean, I think, you can't even look at Jefferson, who is like, in some ways the poet of democracy and, speaks about the injustice of slavery. Yeah, he knew it was wrong as he owned or assumed that he owned people. Yeah. So I don't think, I think sometimes people point at the founding period and say, well, they didn't know, right? It was in their time. They didn't know. No, they knew. They knew. The question is, what did they choose to do with that knowledge? Did they choose to recognize that? Did they assume that, yeah, okay, it's bad, but it's the way it is? Different question. But I don't think you can let that generation off the hook by saying that they somehow didn't think there was anything wrong with the institution of slavery. They justified it in some way, sometimes in rather wacky ways, but they justified it, they rationalized it. They did a lot of things to make it, to emphasize what they saw as its necessity and centrality and how it was bound up with Southern identity and everything else. And many, many people have written about that. But yeah, I don't think they thought, some people argued, no, it's good because, Black people can't tend to themselves. So look at us, we're doing wonderful things for them. And that's fine. But did those same people necessarily, if you ask them, say, is slavery a great thing? They might have said, well, that's true. But, the institution does have some problems. I don't think anyone would 3 cheers for slavery. Unquestionably, I think everyone understood that there were problems inherent in it, even the people who were speaking out against it. They took part in it, acknowledged that it was bad, and then continued to enslave people. So I won't go into detail because it's obviously a huge question. But it connects back, pardon? Yeah, but it connects back with what I said right earlier, which is that well, as you were just saying, who is included and who isn't included, and the failures matter a lot. That's again part of also that same kind of logic. Gosh, you guys are going on here.
Going crazy in the chat. So Tim is asking, did the founders have any experience with what we would nowadays call a national strike, what they might call popular passions to move legislators to act?
Did he think of like people going on strike?
Like these people that, like the students that walked out the day after the shooting, or the people who've been protesting for Roe v. Wade, like these massive national walkouts and things.
I don't know if they would have thought about national, right? In this period, certainly in the 1790s, even the early 19th century, the assumption that something would happen nationally is, not entirely impossible. But if you think about the colonies and then the states before the Constitution as little nation states, and the fact that the Constitution kind of yoked them together, but that no one was entirely sure what that meant, the idea that there'd be a unified national anything was hard for them to fathom. And when that kind of happened in 1800, that it seemed like the nation was cohering around specific presidential candidates in a way that they didn't imagine, some of the response to that was, oh, we better change the Constitution because the nation is cohering. But that said, there's a long tradition way before the United States existed of protesting, of people basically asserting that something was unfair and then coming together to protest that unfairness, the price of bread, the customs of some guild or something, that people would come forward and would protest and would, or boycott. So there were definitely widespread movements of that sort. But, one of the interesting things in the revolution that you see that's noteworthy is, it starts out as people in different colonies realizing, acknowledging that they have shared concerns, learning in newspapers and other avenues, but particularly newspapers, what other people in other places are saying and doing about those concerns, and gradually coming into a sense of a shared cause. So part of what you see in the revolution is the discovery that you can do something that way, rather than the assumption that is something that happens. And what happens after the revolution in the 1780s is that just disintegrates, like poof, oh, well, there goes the unity, right? That's it. The revolution ends and people are like, well, that was important. Now let's go back to whatever we were doing before. That's part of what leads to the Constitution, is the of the 1780s, in which people realize, yeah, no, people don't hang together and think nationally by nature. They don't. So that's these are big questions. I feel like I'm reaching all over American history, but they're all big structural questions. It kind of gets back to my point, right? That you can't understand the present without understanding the building blocks of how we got here, good and bad, and the structure of who we are. It's all built on the various pros and cons of the American story over time.
Which is why so many teachers are tuning in or will watch this today after school, because that's what we use to explain why we do what we do every day. So this one comes from Kathleen V. It says, if we want to go to the originalist version, according to Linda Monk's book, The Bill of Rights says that James Madison included the right to bear arms, as well as an exemption for conscientious objectors. Kathleen's question is, can you define where he was going with that language and why it was omitted? Why you think conscientious objectors?
I don't have that at my fingertips. A friend of mine said, I'm going to cling to that in this moment. A friend of mine said, one of the things that I really admire about you as a teacher is that you admit when you don't know things.
You have to do that. You have to do that. That's important. Kids respect that.
Yeah, well, and in this case, I don't.
Well,
right. Well, and in this case, I don't want to pontificate without having the actual details to give you. So you know what I will say is, like I do in my classrooms, Annie, will you remember this? And depending on where we go or what we do next week, I can at least find a way to I could guess at the answer, but I don't want to. I want stuff to give you.
I'm going to copy that question and email it to both of us to remind us.
Perfect. That's perfect.
Thank you, Kathleen. All right. So Cece's asking.
Before you go on to Cece, I want to, it's a short answer, but I want to respond to Melissa, who said, so Hamilton thought you must assume a lack of empathy. Modern liberals talk about empathy as essential for democracy. I'm not sure what to do with that. Hamilton wasn't a liberal. I mean, he really wasn't, right? In the sense of, in many ways, he was a friend of big government, right? Which you might say is liberal. On the other hand, he was someone who really did not trust in democracy. So I do think in some ways, people on the left now think about empathy as part of what I always call the we-ness of the United States, that we have to think of each other and of the nation as a we. And I do think now that that is something that is associated with the left and not so much with the right, sometimes to an extreme degree. But that's another example of how words, liberalism, conservatism, empathy, which in a sense, we're talking about that as a civic sensibility, those things change meaning over time, sometimes so dramatically that you think you're having one conversation and you're literally comparing apples and oranges. But I at least wanted to answer that because it's a really interesting question. So I'm sorry, sorry, Cece, I interrupted you.
Great. So Cece's asking, why do you think there's a group of people who have long tried to interpret the founding documents in the way that they do, by manipulating meaning? And has it always happened since the 19th century or earlier, or do you think it's worse now?
Well, to some degree, it's always happened, right? I mean, if you put words on paper, people are going to interpret those words in different ways, and that's going to happen, right? So I think at different points in American history, the stakes have been very obviously higher in how things are interpreted. And we're at one of those moments, right? Where how we're interpreting pretty core fundamentals about the Constitution, about the Bill of Rights, about American ideals, about words like democracy. We're at a moment where words, the potential impact of words is pretty extreme in a variety of different ways. And I've said this a lot of times over the past years, right? Words matter profoundly. And they lead us to assume certain realities, to assume certain rights, to act in certain ways. And at times when big ideas and big rights and the future of the nation in a pretty transparent way are up for debate, words can create realities that are going to shape what happens. So as a historian, you know, in the same way that I always say, if you, you know, before you respond to propaganda emotionally, which is what it makes you do, to pause for a moment and think about what these people are trying to get you to do. So in other words, think about the words. That's true in a way across the board. You know, it's, if you look at my book, Lurking Over My Shoulder, my most recent book, one of the underlying themes there is this very idea, which is that words matter, and at moments of crisis, they matter a lot. So the last chapter of that book, there, person after person stands up in Congress and says, watch your words, because depending on what you say, you're going to push us into a bad place. And once you say it, it won't be unsaid. So, you know, I actually think we're in one of those moments. And that is someone's going to get bingo. That's part of what drives the extreme contingency of this moment, right? Because someone says something and people respond. That's a much less controlled way of shaping events, right? What are people going to say and how are people going to respond are pretty big questions. But anyway, we are at a moment like that when I really do think, and not just in the realm of propaganda, but generally speaking, the way people talk about things, the words they choose to use are going to shape realities in ways that we don't know, and that we should be aware of that. You know, we should all be good historians and always be thinking about the words that people are using to express things and the reactions to those words and what that suggests about what's actually going on beneath the surface.
Yeah, a group called PACE just about a month ago, I think I put it in the chat before, but I put it in again while you were talking. They did this study and they created all these infographics, how fundraisers on both left and the right are telling people, like, don't use this word when you talk to this audience, use that word, right? Or when you're trying to calm down these CRT parents, you know, don't say this word because that sets them off, but this word is better. So I found that study so fascinating.
And totally true. And it, you know, that reminds me of, there's a strong little peep there, Newbie.
Newbie likes to do.
He does. That's a strong word coming from Newbie.
Words matter, Newbie.
Peeps matter. That's what he's telling us.
Good mug.
Peeps matter does need to be a mug. That reminds me, this idea that certain words have certain meanings. It just reminds me of a fascinating incident in the book when there's a Northerner and a Southerner who are trying to negotiate a potential duel. And Henry Clay, who's, you know, kind of a border state guy, does what you just said. To the Southerner who's involved in this. He says, look, I know you think you can say X, Y, and Z, but he's a Northerner. You have to use this word and you have to say it this way because he's not going to understand what you're saying otherwise. So it's fascinating. I mean, in that case, it's very specific how that makes sense, but in all kinds of ways, words matter. And, you know, if I were a historian looking back at this time period from some distant future, boy, would I be analyzing the rhetoric and the response to the rhetoric and the choices people make about how they express what they say, what they don't say. those are such red flag indicators of underlying desires and goals and, you know, all kinds of shaping factors that aren't necessarily apparent in the words, but boy, they are there.
Yeah, I think the site, The Pudding, I don't know if you've ever seen that website. It's called The Pudding. They made a word cloud out of all the congressional tweets during the last administration to see what words Congress used the most
Wow.
for those 4 years. And it was really fascinating to see, like, you can almost predict the words, but students really had a good time analyzing that.
But that's a great kind of a thing to show the students, because it's not you asserting things. It's actually like, this study was done and this was the response. Let's talk about what that means. Not that people don't believe you as a teacher, but I think an effective way of having an impact above and beyond your saying something is holding out evidence, right? Because we all want our students to use evidence, to think about evidence, to try and understand why things are a certain way rather than just assuming. But that's interesting, logical, but really fascinating.
Okay, so this question comes from Miranda. She's asking, when you're talking about the militia, would today's National Guard, the weekend warriors, sort of be the equivalent of that?
In some ways, the National Guard is akin to the idea of a militia, that are people who do other things and have other jobs. And when they're needed, they're called and they go into action. So that they're related. It's definitely a very close idea to what they would have assumed a militia was. And it's the National Guard, so they can be called for national purpose, but they're, you know, localized. So I suppose in some ways, yeah, that's actually a good comparison. That in some ways, that's a good way of thinking about it. Still, there are questions about, you know, how are they controlled, or who controls them, or when should they be called, or when should they not be controlled, and who are they loyal to, or who are they not loyal to? And that's the glory of federalism, right? That's like, let's create a government where there's divided loyalty, and then let people figure it out as they go, which can be a good thing and which can be a really complicated thing. And that is true in this case as well.
Right.
I
So-
feel like at time.
Oh, are we at time? Okay, we
We're
always
at
have more
time.
questions.
We can have one more question before we.
Okay, just a quick one from Melissa. She was asking, did the early Americans understand slave patrols as armed mobs? That's how we understand them. Why do we freak out about the French Revolution if slave patrols are causing terror?
I'm not sure I follow that. I don't know.
To put it in the chat and maybe we can look at that.
Yeah, I don't.
I think she's wondering, is that how it was interpreted back then? Were they considered armed mobs?
A slave patrol. Well, I don't think in the South they were. You know, I don't think they would have considered them regulatory. Right. I mean, this could be part of a larger conversation, which is about policing.
Well, I think that's where she's going.
Right. Which doesn't exist and kind of exists. And even when it does exist, it's still kind of, you know, there's all kinds of weird, surprisingly, not surprisingly, ways in which the police are sort of tied in with elite people. So they don't really tend to police elite people. They police everybody else. So some things, again, have a deep history. But I don't think slave patrols in the South certainly would have been considered mobs, which suggests dangerous and illicit. I think they would have been seen as a form of policing.
All right,
Okay.
well, we've always got more questions, but we are at time. Do you want to transition to after party now?
I
or-
do. I
All
do.
right. So I guess if Sarah's there, don't we usually stop the recording when we do the after party? I can't remember.
But when we get to the after party, but
The
not
after party. Oh,
not
there
yet.
she
Oh,
is.
yes, we're transitioning. There she is. Okay, folks. So yes, Carol Lee, you're like always ahead of me. So I want to say thank you to all of you for being here on a Friday morning. As always, I thank you for engaging in the conversation of democracy and getting together to discuss how history relates to pretty fundamental things that are going on right now. And it matters. However, whatever size the community is having these discussions, the discussions matter a lot. So as ever, I thank you for this. It matters a lot to me. And I was actually very irked last week when I had to miss, which is why I recorded something. I didn't want to miss an episode, but I was irked that I couldn't be there. So I first off will say, I hope you will return next week. And I actually don't know now the topic that I'll use, but I'll figure it out by the time we meet. Have a wonderful week in the meantime. We are now going to segue into the after party. What that means for anyone here who is new is that we are going to stop recording, but we're going to still keep going. By turning off the camera, it frees us up to speak a little bit more freely, which is why it's the after party. So if you want to stick around and engage in conversations that go all over the place, please stay for the after party. If you beamed in through the NCHE link, you just have to stay here and poof, you will be in the after party. If you are watching on Facebook and would like to join the after party, you need to leave Facebook and go to ncheteach.org/conversations. And I tweet that out all the time in the lead up to these conversations on Friday. So if I said it too quickly, you can very easily find it on Twitter, ncheteach.org/conversations. Okay, so everyone, take care of yourself. There's a lot of anxiety. I really hope you will take care of yourself, do nice things for yourself and your loved ones. And remember that there's always hope and there's always change. And they're possible if we know they're possible. And I, not only do I know they're possible, I have great confidence in them. So I share that with you because I think, like many of you, I have a lot, as the kids say, I mean, I have a lot of feels, right? I really am in a place, and I know many of you are with me. And this is a moment not to block out anger, but to realize that the feelings you're having matter, that you need to take care of yourself, but you also need to recognize that what you're feeling can be motivators to work for change. And this is a moment when that work can be done. So I will stop there. And
Good place to stop the recording with that reflection.
indeed, okay, we are almost up.